It may seem like an impossible task, but we're up for the challenge. Welcome to MojoPlays. Today, we're going to be counting down the top 50 most influential games of all time. This list is based on their influence on the industry and their lasting appeal. For this episode, we are counting down entries number 10 to number 1. Enjoy.
Number 10, Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. For those who frequented arcades in the early years of the 1990s, fighting games were the lifeblood of those fabled halls of yore. Tales endure of gaming enthusiasts gathering around CRT screens, pouring in quarter after quarter, playfully battling for dominance. And what game, pray tell, is more beloved or pivotal to the genre than Capcom's very own Street Fighter II? The first Street Fighter game was a flawed, indistinct experiment in the realm of 1v1 combat, the most substantial success of which was its garnering of sufficient funds to support a sequel. Street Fighter II would be the faster, more diversified follow-up with a roster of characters quite unlike any gaming had seen before. Japanese martial artists, American special force operators, Chinese officers working for Interpol, and an assortment of other interesting folks were gathered together for one large international fighting tournament. Miraculously, this did not erupt into chaos, but instead served as fertile ground for further experimentation and genre definition. Each fighter has their own unique take on a given fighting style, each with their own vibrant and fitting special moves, a concept which came about from bug fixes but has since become industry standard. Who would have guessed? The stages and combatants might perhaps be a bit too rooted in stereotypical aspects of certain cultures, yet for the time this was indisputably a step forward for inclusive representation. And of course there's the matter of the 6-button combo scheme, which has found its way into a number of games too numerous to list in their entirety. All of this to say that Street Fighter II ensured that even the most casual of fighting game players could enjoy the experience without having to memorize controls or know which button does what. However, anyone who did invest the time found a system as intricate and well thought out as they come. Number 9, Final Fantasy. The situation was dire for Square. They anticipated bankruptcy in the near future, thinking that their then forthcoming game Final Fantasy would be their last. One of the main designers, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was planning to leave the industry entirely should the game fail to connect. For everyone involved, it seems as though the end was nigh. Yet here we are, years later, with Final Fantasy having come into its own as a massively prolific franchise with an increasingly ironic name. That first game did more than just profit. It set expectations and inspired ideas as to how Japanese role-playing games should be made for years to come. What's even more amusing is that initially, the game appears to adhere to standard high fantasy tropes without much deviation. You control a quartet of heroes, the Light Warriors, who are sent to aid the surrounding lands and restore 4 elemental orbs to their rightful place. As events progress, it becomes clear that the story's scope extends beyond the here and now, with issues of time travel and the lingering impact of actions coming into sharp focus. Final Fantasy was among the first Japanese-made RPGs to attempt to blend in elements of Western role-playing, like weaknesses to particular elements. Its understated ties to the tradition of tabletop games and its complex world-building for the time made it notable as a stepping stone towards more refined JRPGs in the future. On a greater scale, it also raised awareness for the role-playing genre in general, with many a gamer citing this as their entry point into the genre. Number 8, The Legend of Zelda. When Shigeru Miyamoto set about crafting what would become one of Nintendo's flagship franchises, his core concept was rooted in the joys and tension of exploration. He deliberately drew upon his experiences wandering the caves and forests near Kyoto as a child, attempting to recapture the sense of mystery and natural beauty he'd felt in his youth. The Legend of Zelda reflects his sensibilities in surprising ways, while subverting expectations of how a fantasy setting is supposed to be. The realm of Hyrule is not lush and vibrant, but rather comes across as desolate and harsh. Antagonistic creatures lurk around nearly every corner. Burned trees line the myriad paths, and the land's citizens are hidden away in the mountains. Making any progress as the lone adventurer, Link requires a willingness to search every nook and cranny, keeping one's eyes peeled for important people and items, exactly as Miyamoto intended. It's kinda devious how Miyamoto and his team constructed the world to subtly inspire an explorer's mindset in the player. Yet the results speak for themselves. Link's quest, a mission to rebuild the fragmented Triforce of Wisdom, is made compelling by the drive to search at one's own pace. This kind of open-world approach to an otherwise classically minded fantasy fable was game-changing. The lessons learned from The Legend of Zelda's successful blend of sword and sorcery iconography with a loose narrative structure still live on in the sandbox games of today. Number 7. Doom. In the days of shareware, this was a pivotal turning point. Then newcomer id Software was just emerging as a major player in the computer game development scene, displaying a clear interest in pushing forward action game design. To that end, id's ragtag team set about blending intense shooter gameplay with a boundary-pushing pseudo 3D game engine and horror iconography. What they came up with was Doom, a game that tried to deliver the sights and sounds of B-movie horror within the context of a first-person action experience. Its simple premise of a lone space marine setting out to liberate Mars from Hellspawn was more of an excuse than anything else. What it was really interested in was letting players blast, cut down, and vaporize demons to their heart's content. It almost goes without saying that Doom managed to be an incredible success thanks in no small part to its tight combat, appropriately grotesque yet endearing enemies, and hellscape setting. Many first-person shooters to this day still rely upon the core gameplay loops of clearing foes from rooms and exploring intricately crafted levels that Doom pioneered. It was also pivotal in the realm of online multiplayer. Stories of players meeting up to link up computers and compete in LAN battles were all too common in the 90s. The careful consideration it paid to its multiplayer suite, from offering maps capable of handling multiple people running around at once to balancing weapon damage with player health, remains the bedrock on which all online shooter design rests. Number 6. Space Invaders. Many titles have been cited over the years as the starting point for the so-called golden age of arcade games, roughly stated to have run from 1976 to 1983. The thing is, it's never quite clear until well after the fact what precisely was the point at which the world, any world, was at its best. All we can say with certainty is that whether at the time of the release or now, Space Invaders mattered as an understated step forward. It's considered one of the first known entries in the shooter game, a broad descriptor whose most consistent theme is games in which a weapon is fired to destroy something or someone. In the case of Space Invaders, your primary opponents were row after row of slowly descending alien spaceships, and your task was to blast every single one of them into oblivion. While there were 4 shields behind which the player-commanded laser cannon could hide, ultimately their lifespan was limited by however long it took for laser fire to cut through them. The setup is simple yet tense in the way that only classic arcade games could be. Your rate of fire is consistent, but the ships grow faster as their numbers decrease, eventually becoming too fast to cut down. The scaling difficulty and increasing speed work well in the game's favor, especially since the central gameplay is so functional and easy to grasp. There's never a moment where the objective is unclear, and the play continues as long as the player's reflexes remain on point. Complex, it may not have been, but foundational to the very idea of shooters? Hell yes. Number 5. Donkey Kong. A woman named Pauline has been kidnapped by a giant ape who has taken her to the top of a construction site. You, a carpenter known only as Jumpman, must climb up each level of the building in order to save Pauline. Barrels and oil drums get tossed in your path, and the way ahead is lined with conveyor belts and ladders galore. This is the setup for Donkey Kong, which fell under the purview of first-time director Shigeru Miyamoto and producer Gunpei Yokoi. Miyamoto's design approach was to invent a whole new way of engaging with games, narrative-driven gameplay conveyed via short animated scenes. Jumpman, or Mario as we'd later learn, was our working-class hero. Donkey Kong was the villain, and Pauline was the damsel in distress. Its implementation of a plot and distinct characters, however rudimentary they may seem now, was groundbreaking for the time, to say nothing of the game being a notable precursor to the platformer genre. Donkey Kong is seen as one of the first, if not the first, in a line of games with clear stories underlining the gameplay, meaning game narratives as a concept owe a great debt to it. With this game, Nintendo sought to make a name for itself in the North American game market. Donkey Kong supposedly earned over $100 million for Nintendo within its first year. The game's success set up Nintendo to thoroughly dominate the coming decade and allowed their industry-reshaping measures to come to fruition. Number 4. Tetris. A lot can be said of the culture that arose from the Cold War, but one thing that stood out is how brilliance came from such unexpected places. No one can honestly claim to have predicted that a random employee of a Soviet-run R&D department would conceive of the most recognizable puzzle game of all time. And yet here we are, decades later, having seen countless incarnations of Alexei Pajitnov's classic Tetris. 7 types of blocks vaguely shaped like letters fall onto a rectangular grid. Your job is to position them while they fall in order to complete row after row and clear the grid. That's the game in a nutshell, complexity only really arising from increased speed of the blocks, but that's its great strength. Tetris has no need to be overwrought with details and context. It just offers an addictive gameplay loop and lets the player decide whether to get invested in it or not. Suffice to say, this approach has worked out well for Pajitnov and company. The original game's success on home computers led to the creation of the 1989 version for the Nintendo Game Boy, which is perhaps the most popular incarnation of Tetris. Pajitnov went on to found the Tetris company, enabling him to receive royalties and expand the Tetris brand for generations to come. Number 3. Pong. We'd be hard-pressed to find one person alive who has never heard of Pong. The simplicity at play is almost ridiculous to consider. You control a paddle in a basic game of table tennis. Your opponent, either a living human serving as player 2 or a computer-controlled equivalent, makes use of a paddle opposite yours. You move the paddle up and down in order to deflect a constantly moving ball into the opponent's goal for points. And that's it. That's the entire game. Despite what must have been great skepticism about its potential for success, Pong was an honest-to-goodness smash hit. Reports indicate that Atari was able to sell Pong cabinets for several times the production cost. And the presence of Pong clones, games that borrow the paddle and ball deflection concepts for other purposes, speaks leagues about what kind of impact the original game had on the burgeoning game industry. On the business side, Atari was able to expand and develop more games for the arcade and home consumption as a result. This simple game about virtual table tennis not only established Atari as a viable brand, but proved the viability of gaming as a profitable industry. Arcade owners took notice of the money Pong pulled in, which almost certainly ensured a generation would grow up with one foot firmly in the world of arcades. Number 2. Pacman. He's a yellow orb with a mouth. He eats pellets while moving in a straight line horizontally or vertically. He's chased at every turn by 4 ghosts, Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde, who will kill him instantly on contact. Occasionally, he can consume special power-ups to turn the table on the ghosts, making them flee in fear. This is the entire concept from start to finish of Pacman, a game viewed by many as the video game. It's by far the most well-known in terms of pop culture ubiquity. References to the arcade game, parody or otherwise, can be found in any number of films and TV shows. Most people who know of gaming are at least familiar with Pacman and can usually rattle off their knowledge of the core gameplay at the drop of a hat. Part of that can be attributed to the sheer beautiful simplicity of the game's visual language. It all takes place on a black screen overlaid with a blue maze and yellow dots, the aforementioned pellets, with Pacman and the ghosts standing out with their pastel color scheme. Pacman raised the bar in terms of easy-to-comprehend visual cues in the golden age of arcade games. Pacman's influence on the industry and the numerous titles inspired by its core gameplay are the reason why people still enjoy it to this day. Number 1. Super Mario Bros. When one looks at the broad scope of the video game industry, its inception, its evolution over the years, the formation of its genres and themes, only one title comes to mind as truly pivotal. The 1985 classic Super Mario Bros. Is that title. A game responsible for inventing and solidifying the tropes of the 2D platformer genre, as well as giving the game's industry its second wind. The world of the Mushroom Kingdom remains a case study in how best to convey personality and atmosphere within the limits of an era's technology. Its bright pastel color scheme, brick-and-mortar architecture, and animal-like inhabitants were revolutionary for the time. the hero, Mario, was ingenious. A seemingly ordinary plumber made superhuman by the game's fantasy setting. The jaunty chiptune soundtrack, the charming characteristics of Mario's enemies, the clever secrets hidden throughout the levels, all of this would be remarkable and admirable in its own right. What helps cement Super Mario Bros. As a defining game is its expert craftsmanship and tight gameplay. The jumping mechanics remain hard to surpass in terms of careful balance between agility and accessibility. The placement of obstacles and enemies is downright inspired, and power-ups like the Fire Flower and Starman have ingrained themselves into the public consciousness. There's one more thing to consider when talking about why Super Mario Bros. Matters so much to video games. The industry as we know it might not exist without Super Mario Bros. After the game crash of 1983, many were uncertain of Nintendo's first true home console, the Nintendo Entertainment System. How could a company known primarily for making toys and playing cards succeed in the wake of the crash? What could Nintendo bring to the table that would save gaming after Atari and others nearly killed it? Mario was the answer. Packed in with the NES at launch, Super Mario Bros. Sold tens of millions of copies over its lifetime, standing as the best-selling game released for a single console for 30 years. Its success led to massive sales for the NES, which in turn prompted companies like Sega to venture into the console-making business in order to compete. It revitalized an entire industry, brought it back from the brink. It rescued gaming at its most dire. Everything that came afterwards, every accomplishment and every step forward could not have existed without the aid of a mustachioed plumber from Brooklyn. That, above all, is why Super Mario Bros. Is the most influential video game of all time.
Check out these other great clips from MojoPlays, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.